One of the most common things I do as a front-end engineer is work with JSON data, either given to me by the backend or created on the front end, taking that information and then mapping it somehow to the DOM. So I thought it might be a good idea to take that and make a video about all of the highlights of working with JSON information. So if you're either struggling to work with JSON objects now, or you haven't seen the benefits of using them yet, I hope you like what you see. Now, if you do find any of the information in this video useful, feel free to drop a like, subscribe, and comment to help grow the channel. Also, before we get started, as always, all of the information that we cover will be on my GitHub, so I'll throw a link in the description. So feel free to download that and follow along if you'd like. And if you do, don't be afraid to hit that star and let me know that you are taking advantage of what I'm offering. So in this video, we're going to cover what JSON objects are, how to work with them, how you go about parsing them and stringifying them, and then we're going to take a look at a practical example. So, what is JSON? Now, it stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's essentially the native object of the JavaScript language. And you might be wondering why you even say JavaScript Object Notation if that's a little redundant. And the reason is that it's somewhat of the standard data structure of the web. And so you see it implemented in a ton of other languages that are often used as server-side languages to help work with the client side in a cohesive way. So it's sort of the standard for AJAX and HTTP request communication. How do you work with them? So first of all, it's important to remember that on the client side, it's passed by reference. And if you don't know what that means, I can link a video that I did before talking about that. But the short side of it is that when you pass it as a variable, whatever function is working with it is actually going to access the original object, not just a copy of it. So that's just something you have to keep in mind. Now, an object is composed of key-value pairs, where values can be any kind of JavaScript data structure. And so that's going to go inside of curly brackets, where we can say, my key, this is a value, like that. And here we see my key, and the value can be a string, or we can also say my second key and set that to 45, for example. And now these are accessed in two primary ways. The first is like an attribute, where you're just saying dot and then the key. Or you can also, similar to how arrays allow you to reference at a specific position, you can use those square brackets and just pass in a string of the key. And so, for example, if your key has a space in it, then of course you're going to have to reference it like this because you're not able to reference the key with a space. So we've got a sample JSON object here, example.json, and I put that in the global scope. And so if I log that out, we can see we've got sample number, sample array, sample object, sample string. And so if I just say dot and start typing sample, Chrome is going to recognize we've got sample array, object, string, but you won't see the sample number. And the reason for that is because of that space. And so what I have to do is use these square brackets, and then I can say sample number, and there it recognized it, 100. So it's relatively easy to work with. Now we also have this sample object is another object within an object. And so if I say example JSON.sample object, that then allows me to once again say dot and get access to any of the attributes there. So is bad example, of course, is false. I don't give bad examples. And if we say is example, yes. And we see that in the code. So as you can see, it's relatively easy to deal with. I think a lot of times where people run into problems is once you start nesting objects within objects or objects within arrays within objects. And a big part of that, I think a lot of times, is kind of doing what we did here, which is log out the object in the console and kind of playing around with it to get a sense of what's all going on. Because once you can click on and see, okay, this is just an array with a bunch of Booleans at that point, you start to understand what's all going on. So let's clear this off and head to the next section, parse and stringify. So backend systems may use strings of JSONs to transmit data. The JSON class has two static methods to help out with that, JSON.parse and JSON.stringify. And so here we can say JSON.stringify and just take that JSON from above, example.json. And so what we can see is just the same object as a string. Now, JavaScript also has built-in functions to help working with network calls. And the reason for that is you can make a string of the JSON object, but that doesn't work passing it in a URL because you have things like spaces or other characters that aren't allowed to be in a URL. And so we're able to encode the information with encode URI. And so what we can do is take this right here, encode that, and you see you still have things like sample string and all of that, but you don't have any of the spaces. So the challenge here is just to turn the following string into a usable object. So I'm going to take this, copy that, and I will just say challenge string, and we have to make sure that that is a string, like that. And what we're going to do here is essentially the opposite of what we just did, is we first need to decode this string to take out these encoded values. So we can say decode URI of our challenge string, and we see already that we have a string of an object. And from there, we just want to say JSON.parse to parse the string of the object, just like that. Boom, we've got it. And the message, subscribe now. Interesting. Anyways, we will clear that off and head on to our practical example. What we're doing in our practical example is simulating an already parsed response from the server. And so we can see here, response JSON, success, true, and then we've got an array of objects, which are people. So we've got Billy Bob, Lisa Lou, Eddie Ott, and their ages. Now we are also given this function person to HTML string. And the goal is to render each person from the response into the div below, which has an ID people. And that's what we see right here, which is right now empty. And we're given these hints that a normal for loop works fine and map for bonus credit. So I won't do the map today. I do cover that in a video about looping through arrays that I can also link above. And if you already know how to do that, then feel free to follow along, but just do the better version of what we will do now. So the way we can approach this is by first just getting access to the data we want. We don't need to go through response.json.people every time just to access that same array. So I might say const people is set to response.json.people. And there we just have direct access to that array. And so one thing that we can keep in mind is that since we want to include all of the information inside of this div, what we can do is say const people div is set to document.getElementById, and that's just people. And so people div has inner HTML, which we can set to whatever, as long as it is HTML. Oops, let's make that hello. But more importantly, it's not just text. You can say actual HTML, and that'll be included in there as well. And what person to string does is give us that string of HTML. And so if I say people 0, we can see we've got this div of the information that we want to show. So all we need to do here is first say let HTML string of people be an empty string. And then we can just loop through the array that we have and add to this string. So I will say for const person of people. And here, first thing we can do is just say console.log person to see what we're working with. And here we see we already now have access to each individual person that we see in the people array. So instead of saying console.log, we can say HTML string of people should be added to with person to HTML string of the person, which now we see has all of the HTML that we want. And so all we have to do now is say that the people div.inner HTML is now going to be set to our HTML string of people. And just like that, we've mapped the information that was in our object to the DOM. So we can see Billy Bob, age 34, Lisa Lou, 53, Eddie Ott, 40. And obviously, this is an extremely bare bones example, but when you really think about what we've done, it's an extremely powerful concept. For example, this could be an admin application where we're getting a list of users, and maybe we aren't just past name and age, but we're past their ID. We then could include a button that says delete user, where we include the ID of the user, and when you press it, the front end can generate a call to the server to delete that user, passing in the same ID that would be in this list. So it opens up a lot of doors. And again, it's something that's pretty simple once you do a few examples and get the hang of it. So let's move on to final thoughts. Working with JSON data is an integral part of front-end engineering. And a part of that is knowing how to parse, stringify, encode, decode, which, like we said before, is pretty quick to nail down. Now, with just a little bit of practice, it's also easy to get the hang of in terms of manipulating the data and accessing layered information. And the final point that I want to make is that a lot of times you may have to work with backend engineers to make sure that data is structured correctly. And this is something that I think is very important for every front-end engineer to know. And that's that you have to kind of take ownership a little bit in a team project, where it might be easier for the backend guy just to throw an object with a bunch of information that's not specifically organized in any great way. And when it gets to you, you have to go through the headache of destructuring the data and figuring out just how everything goes together. So when you're working on a project with a backend engineer, you might just describe how you would like the data to be formatted. It might be just the same for him or her to structure it that way, and it saves you a bunch of time on your end. And that's something that I didn't understand right away in my career, is that you can also speak up and say, hey, this is how I think it should be structured. It'll save me a bunch of time. And they'll say, okay. And just like that, you might have saved yourself an hour or two. So keep that in mind. Anyways, guys, I think that's going to do it for this video. Hope you liked it. Like I said at the beginning, subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff is going to help grow the channel. All right, see you next time.